Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel Tech with Ashwant. In this video, let us break down all the different compute options that are available in Databricks. So if you see here, there are 5 different compute options that are available, and the use cases as to when we are going to use those compute options are slightly different. So let us go ahead and understand all of those in detail in this video. Let's get into it. So if you see my screen, the first option that we have is all-purpose compute. So as the name itself says, this use case basically when we are going to use this all-purpose compute is when we are developing an application or whenever you are developing a PySpark code, you're going to use this, all-purpose compute. When you're exploring something, when the code is still under development, when you're using notebooks and you can use this for ad hoc analysis basically. The main features, if I want to talk about, it supports multiple users working together. For example, if you have a single compute and you want multiple users to collaborate and work on a particular project, you can use the all-purpose compute. Of course, there are other options with the all-purpose compute as well, like single user compute. For example, if you want to develop something on your own compute server, that's also available. And this is kind of, in general, I'm talking about. So this supports multiple users who can work together. And it can be used with notebooks, like I mentioned. It can be used with dashboards, AI, BI dashboards, and you can also call APIs on top of this cluster. And cost is slightly higher because it's always running. So right? So all-purpose clusters are spun up and it keeps on running until and unless you terminate it or the inactivity set on the cluster is increased, and then it will automatically shut down after the inactivity period is ticked. Right? So if you ask me what is the good reason for me to use all-purpose cluster, if that's the scenario, I would ask if you are exploring the data and if you're checking the data and if you're trying to run ad hoc analysis, then go for all-purpose cluster and start using it. And if you want to test a pipeline really quickly, then it's good for that as well. So that's why I've mentioned testing pipelines as well. The second type of cluster is job compute. But if you want to know how to create all-purpose cluster and job compute, I've already created a separate video on that. You can see that in the Databricks series, Zero to Hero. I've explained how to create all-purpose cluster, how to create job cluster. There is no way to directly create a job cluster. You have to create a job, and if you run a job, it will automatically spin up a job cluster, and after the completion of the job, it is going to go ahead and terminate the cluster automatically. So you don't have to manually create a job cluster. So the use cases for running job cluster is, as the name itself says, job compute. You're going to run your production job, which is already developed, and it does make sense that you are not going to utilize this job cluster for development activities, and you use this job compute really less compared to the other all-purpose or SQL warehouse or other types of cluster. Because as you can see here, whenever the job is already written and it is moved to production, you will start using the job compute to run those codes. So rather than just using it for testing or something like that. And you can also run your scheduled pipelines if you have, and that's a very good use case for using a job compute. Like I mentioned, it spins up when a job starts and terminates whenever the job ends. It automatically terminates that. And it's more cost effective than the previous one because, as I mentioned, the previous one, you will shut down whenever you want. But in the job compute, it will automatically terminate once the job is completed or job execution is completed. So it fails or not, nevertheless, it goes ahead and terminates the cluster. And it can't be used for interactive notebooks. For example, if you have a notebook that you want to run, you cannot create a job cluster and attach a notebook and run it. Although there are different ways to achieve that, but it's not recommended to do that. And you cannot go ahead and ask Databricks that I face this issue when I'm running an interactive notebook, because they do not recommend using interactive notebooks with the job cluster. Rather, it's used for scheduled jobs. Now you might ask me, I have a notebook that I want to schedule as a job. Can I do that? Yes, of course you can do that. But what I'm saying is, after the job cluster is created, let's say there is a job that is running, and parallelly if you want to attach a notebook to that and run executions, that's not recommended. So the other option is compute pools. So as the name itself says, they have a pool of compute. So this was the the intention to create compute pools was to reduce the startup time and the cost for the cluster. So if you ever used a Databricks or the cluster of Spark, to spin up the cluster itself, it takes at least 6 to 8 minutes for the ad hoc cluster to be created, because it is going to run all the dependencies and it is going to install Spark on top of the cluster and so on and so forth. So that time is required. So if you want to reduce that startup time and cost for the cluster, so these are the option, that is compute pools. Basically, these are pre-warmed compute resources that are already available for you to use, and it saves cost by avoiding the cold start time. So you don't have to wait until the cluster is up, because like I mentioned, these are pre-warmed compute resources, and these can be used for both job and all-purpose clusters. So that's the use case of compute pools. The fourth one or the important one is SQL warehouses. As the name itself says, you can use this cluster for running SQL workloads. If you have a SQL query and if you have a dashboard that you have and you want to refresh the dashboard every second or every minute or every hour, you can achieve that using the SQL warehouse. So previously they used to call this as SQL endpoints, but rather now they have changed it to SQL warehouse. So it connects easily to your AI BI tools like Power BI, Tableau, and whatever you're using on the other hand. And it's optimized for SQL queries, not for Spark jobs. So you can run PySpark code and your SQL queries on ad hoc clusters or the all-purpose clusters or the job clusters, but SQL warehouses are completely restricted for your SQL queries, and you cannot run PySpark code on the SQL warehouse. So that's important point to remember. So this is highlighted. So the fifth and the most important one, which I like generally, which is serverless compute. So as the name itself says, you don't have to manage the server, or you don't have to worry about the resource management, and it's best for cost and scaling. So let's say you do not know, you have a code and you do not know what exact the workload is doing, meaning how much data it is analyzing or how much time it takes. You never know that. So in that scenario, it's better to use serverless compute, as it auto scales and auto terminates whenever the job execution is completed, and you don't have to manage the instances. Like the Databricks will do all the things for you, and it's ideal for unpredictable workloads. Like I mentioned, you do not know what's the number of data that you are querying, or how much records are you querying. So in that scenario, you can go ahead and use a serverless compute. So just to refresh, there are 5 different types of compute parts, that is all-purpose compute, job compute, compute pools, a SQL warehouse, and SQL compute or serverless compute. I do not call compute pools as a separate compute cluster, but I wanted to include that as a separate topic, so I have done that. So if you're not taking a note of it, please have a copy of your notes beside you. So whenever you're watching my videos, you can take notes, and it's easy to understand if you go ahead and refresh it. So I've already created a separate video as to how you can create a all-purpose cluster and a job cluster. Feel free to check that out. I think it's video number 6 or 7 in the Databricks Zero to Hero series. So if you're liking the content that I'm creating, please consider subscribing and share it with your friends. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video and another interesting topic.